Hello everybody, recording live from somewhere. This is Zach Couples with episode number 55. I can't drive 55 of the Movement Debrief. And tonight, ladies and gentlemen, it's gonna be off the heezy for sheezy. We're gonna talk about three things. We're gonna talk about asymmetrical infrasternal angles. What if your rib cage is all cattywampus and whatnot? How do you fix that? I'll tell you. We're going to talk about SI joint testing. Can you test them? Do you want to test them? Is it worthwhile testing that? And is it better than some of the tests that I advocate for on this site? Stay tuned. And last but not least, we're going to talk about imaginary lat syndrome. Except these lats be real, fam. That's what's on docket for tonight. These are questions asked from the people, answered for the people, by this people, fam recognized fam. Before I dive in, a little bit of housekeeping. It's 6 weeks out, I believe-ish. Guys, September 15th and 16th, The Human Matrix is coming to Seattle, Washington. October 27th and 28th, Kansas City, Missouri, Kansas, whatever. And last but not least, Portland, Oregon, November 10th and 11th. It is crunch time and you probably want to think about signing up. It's going to be good. I just got the manual about finished. If you want to help people who hurt in multiple areas, if you're a clinician or you're a coach, I don't really care. Or if you are a trainer, you want to get your people moving better. You want to get the squats looking prettier. You want to get them deadlifting like crazy. You want to know the key cues to making those moves look better. You probably want to sign up. There'll be a link in the show notes when you go to zachcouples.com after this to re-watch, to check it out. Without further ado though, let's debrief, shall we? The first question comes from Shane. Shane asks, any recommendations for an asymmetrical infrasternal angle? By cranking, I do have some recommendations, Shane. Let's first talk about what that is. There will also be a picture of one in the show notes because I think a lot of the peeps who I be talking about or talking with don't, we understand that there's an asymmetry side to side, but what is like a legitimate asymmetrical infrasternal angle? Basically, if you are a legitimate asymmetrical infrasternal angle, you're going to be narrow on one side, wide-ish on the other. So if we're thinking that 90 degrees is our exceptional norm, or our model norm, I know it's probably not perfect, but that's what we're going to work with. Let's assume 90 is normal. If I am less than a 45, or we'll say 45 degrees on either side. If I am less than 45 degrees on one side and much greater than 45 degrees on another, that's an asymmetrical infrasternal angle. What isn't? I'm 15 on the left and 30 on the right. I'd still call that narrow. I would treat it as a narrow, yada, yada, yada. Same thing on the wide. If I am, let's say, 50 on the left and 75 on the right. I don't know if that's possible. Yeah, it is. But let's say those are my numbers. Still wide. Treat it as such. You want to get them close to 45s. We're looking at someone less than 45 on the left, typically, greater than 45 on the right. The reason why that is has to do with the internal organ anatomy. Let me do that again. Internal organ anatomy. You got a heart on this side, liver on this side, asymmetry within the guts. And that predisposes the left to be a little bit more narrow, the right to be a little bit more wide. Because as the left descends, it's got nothing stopping it. The right, however, has that hunk and liver, which limits how far it can descend. So you will likely be narrow on the left, wide on the right. Just saying. What do you do to treat it though? Well, I'm glad you guys asked. Treatment basically involves taking concepts from the narrow, concepts from the wide, putting them together in a beautiful movement orchestra. Breathing wise, think of it this way, from a mechanical standpoint, as the diaphragm descends, the bucket handle ought to open up and be a little bit wider. And this is how theoretically we get our wide infrasternal angle people, as they're stuck with a little bit of diaphragm descension and the rib cage widens. As I pass through that, the diaphragm flattens. The diaphragm's pull on the lower portions of the rib cage changes. So what happens is the lateral dimensions of the rib cage start to shrink. and the ribs become a little bit more straighter than they are bendier in the case of the wide. That's your narrow. So in these cases, we can see that there is a progression from normal, big scare quotes in that, from normal to wide and then to narrow. So the narrow is the furthest progression of the three. From a breathing standpoint, because we know with our narrow infrasternal angle people, we want to use an open mouth sigh. The reason why we want that is because on the narrow side, some of the abdominals get a little bit better leverage to contract, external obliques in particular. And if you go forceful, you're going to kick in those EOs, and ain't nobody having fun because you're not going to allow the diaphragm to fully ascend. So we want to use a sigh strategy so we don't kick those guys in, sneak attack our way to allow that diaphragm to ascend. You do that, you'll be in business. On the wide, we know that we have to be a little bit more forceful to get the rib cage to close down so that infrasternal angle is normalized. In the asymmetrical case, when you're starting out, let me be clear about that, when you are starting out, I typically start these individuals with that prolonged sigh because I'm going to go after the, I don't want to say worse because I think it's not like a better or worse, but I want to go with the diaphragmatic sigh that is lower. Because my hope is that by doing that, it will at least get that portion taken care of and I don't run the risk of closing that angle further, which can happen with a forceful exhalation. Trust me, I've done it. Fortunately, it's very reversible. So you want to go with the long sigh to start. Once you get the infrasternal angle a bit more dynamic, you get maybe you're closer to 45 on that left, maybe that right side's still riding high. Then maybe you can use a forceful exhalation to help that individual to get that closed down. When we get our people mobile in this infrasternal angle and we're not stagnant in one position, either breathing strategy should suffice. We should be able to have that capability. Just because you are a narrow to start doesn't mean you can't use wide strategies to finish. Arm position standpoint. With the left side, assuming that's the narrow side, which typically it is because of the anatomy, we're thinking a forward reach. What that's going to do is that's going to allow internal obliques, going to allow pecs to pull the rib cage backwards, create a little bit of bend in the rib cage, create that long sigh, and that should allow the narrow portion of the infrasternal angle to open up with the right. Go just slightly overhead. What that's going to do is that's going to put some of the abdominals on stretch. It's going to allow the front to back dimensions, which are limited in the wide, to come up. And you let an exhale to capture those external obliques. So that's your arm position. Left is reaching forward at about 90 degrees, making sure I don't hunch. It's a forward reach like so. This one's overhead. And when I exhale, I'm lengthening both. Those would be the arm positions that you would utilize. From a lower extremity standpoint, you're going to do whatever it is you need to down there to get the tests to change. If you have someone who's limited bilaterally on an obers test, do something that engages hamstrings and glutes to improve that. If you got someone who's asymmetrical, treat them as an asymmetrical. I'll link a few activities in the show notes that I like to use for these people. Asym activities. So to summarize, for the asymmetrical infrasternal angle, sigh to start. Let me summarize before that. To summarize, asymmetrical infrasternal angle, you got someone who's less than 45 on one side, much greater than 45 on the other. Typically, the narrow side is the left, the wide side is the right, unless you got some funky stuff going on organ-wise. Breathing strategy, you want to use a long sigh because that captures the lower diaphragms of the two, which would be the left, and your arm position ought to be at 90 degrees flexion on the left, arm overhead on the right. And if you do those things with your asymmetrical infrasternal angle people, you ought to be in business. So Shane, phenomenal question. Thank you for your contributions to the fam. Boom. Next question comes from Katie. Katie asks, what are the pros/cons of using the obers test versus standing forward flexion / Gillet's test to look at SI dysfunction or pelvic rotation. Katie, that's an unbelievable question. Thank you for asking it. For those of you who do not know what the Gillet test is, I'll link a video of it in the show notes. But basically, the Gillet test is a motion palpation exam in which you put your hands on the SI joint regions and you are trying to feel those areas move or not move as the hip is, I believe, flexed and extended. I believe that would be a Gillet and a reverse Gillet respectively. Basically, it's a motion palpation test. These were a lot of tests that were championed by osteopaths to measure SI joint function, dysfunction, yada, yada, yada. They would use this to check position, do whatever it is that they were going to do from a treatment standpoint, recheck position. Life is good. They also would utilize some just static testing to assess motion palpation, or the SI joint position. And in fact, a lot of the books that you may read when you start to go down this rabbit hole, you'll get into some of that when they talk about the zinc patterns, among other things. All of that stuff was done via palpation. Gillet test is a motion palpation test. Why is it that I don't use something like that versus an obers test? I think with testing, the big key, even though it's not objective, like anytime we do a test, and I would have to credit Bill on this, Ian, I will answer your question afterwards, but anytime there is let me copy Ian's question momentarily. There we go. Anytime you utilize a test, there is subjectivity involved. There is our subjective interpretation of what we are seeing when we perform a given test. And no test is 100% accurate because there's always going to be human error. In fact, I think there is a degree of inaccuracy even with those tests that are fairly accurate, because a lot of times we're going to do an activity and have a particular expectation of an outcome. And I'm very much guilty of this myself, where I do something and I expect this to change, and sometimes I get lax with my testing, and that's not always a good thing, because you don't make sound decisions when you're not sharp with your tests. So with that in mind, it would behoove us as people who are utilizing tests to choose testing that is reliable, at least within ourselves, because we're going to be working with that client in front of us, not necessarily other people. If you are passing people along from person to person, then maybe an inter-rater reliability is a little bit more important. But again, I have to give props to Bill Hartman, who I'll link in the show notes, for making me appreciate that a little bit more in terms of not sweating inter-rater reliability as much as you should intra. That is, making sure you choose accurate tests. So why do I use an obers test maybe to assess the SI region? I'm going to get into that a little bit more, versus some of the motion palpation testing. There will be a crap ton of things to read in the show notes on this, but basically what I did was I looked through the research to try to find how reliable are these tests. There's a lot of research on the SI joint tests compared to the obers, just a heads up. But with some of the SI joint tests, if you look at the Gillet test alone, there was a study done, I believe it was in '99, that showed that it was pretty unreliable. And there was another test done, I believe in '09, that showed, just looking at tests alone, Gillet being one of them, the intra-rater reliability ranged from 0.36 to 0.84. Closer to 1.0 you get, the better. That's a huge range with some of these motion palpation tests. Not necessarily good. What the problem we run into is when you're using your hands to find and feel particular things, a lot of times you're going to trick yourself in terms of feeling what you think you should feel. Now, that being said, these numbers, very small, but a little bit improved when you did a cluster of motion palpation tests. Intra-rater reliability went from 0.44 to 0.92. Still kind of weak sauce if you ask me. So point being, with those tests, it's not the most reliable. Compare that to the obers test. One study, so Please realize that the literature is not that great. I will readily admit that. But for the obers test, the intra-rater reliability with that one study, granted they were using an inclinometer, which who uses that stuff, 0.9 to 0.91. That seems to be a significantly better number. Hence, also because I think that's a bit more measurable, I could at least in theory use an inclinometer. I can track changes over a period of time, and to me that seems a bit more reliable than trying to find and feel something moving. That would be the biggest reason why I think an obers test or any type of test where you're measuring range of motion seems to be a much better choice than something like a motion palpation. Two things with that though, because Katie, you did state that are these tests looking at SI dysfunction or pelvic rotation? And I don't know to what extent either of those tests are looking at that in that regard. The SI joint testing is a little bit far-fetched for me because we're relying on palpation. There seems to be a lot of inaccuracy in regards to palpation. And it turns out there's a lot of tissue that you have to go through in order to feel the SI joint, period. Can we really say that we're measuring this thing move? I don't know. I don't know if we can say that about the obers test either. While there can be some theoretical underpinnings in terms of what's going on, if you look at dead guy anatomy, anatomic investigation of the obers test, which I've linked ad nauseum, and I'll link it again, why not? They've shown that test to improve when you cut out posterior elements in the hip, posterior capsule, posterior musculature, etc. So is it really testing that? I don't know. I think there's a lot of things that move when you take a hip into adduction, or even when you perform a gelée or reverse gelée test through flexion and extension. The point being is there's a lot of things going on anytime we perform an objective test. It's likely measuring a lot more than we think it's measuring. The biggest key that we have to understand is if someone can't do something with a test that's meaningful to us, one, but more importantly, meaningful to the patient or the client too, and it helps you with your decision making and helping them meet their goals, as long as you are consistent with your testing and you're tracking things in the right direction, I'm not offended by it. That's the biggest key, is we have to use tests that help us get us the best outcome for our people. If that is a gelée, reverse gelée test for you, I got no beef. Just realize that your reliability probably isn't as good as it could be with maybe an obers test, although the literature is very sparse on that as well. To summarize, your question, Kate, I don't use the motion palpation testing such as a gelée because it's less reliable than obers, though I realize the literature is not so hot. Are we measuring dysfunction and pelvic rotation? Meh, who knows what we're measuring. All I'm trying to do is try to restore as much mobility, movement variability, whatever you want to call it, as humanly possible. So we get better distribution of workload throughout the body, we help our people meet their goals, and life is good. Thank you, Katie, so much for your question. The last question comes from Tyler, and actually kind of Ashley as well. So I'm going to kind of combine these questions together because it's my show and I can do things like that. Tyler, next week, can you please discuss imaginary lat syndrome? Asking for a friend. Thank you. Thanks, love you. Excuse me. Love you too. Man. Ashley also asked, because this plays into it, hey Zach, I have a debrief question. Do you think you could break down the role of the latissumus dorsi on the T-spine? I can do both those things. And Ian, I did not forget your question, so this won't be the last question. How about that? All right, imaginary lat syndrome. What's that? Basically, you ever been walking around minding your own business when all of a sudden you see this bro, or maybe chica, I don't really care, walking with these arms way wide and hey, what's good with you? You ever see that? This would be the imaginary lat syndrome, where the arms are so far out because there's these supposed lats that are putting them into that position and they're huge, but they're not. That is imaginary lat syndrome. It's a pandemic in gyms all across the globe, especially those more of the bodybuilding origin. There's hope. We have to first understand why this syndrome occurs, what's going on from a movement standpoint, and what can we do about it. Here's the deal. We first must understand how can I really get the lats kicking into high gear? Muscles do not act within their own. They're only going to contract or relax or be concentric or eccentrically oriented when they get leverage to do so. So if I'm a lat and I want to get leverage, how will I do that? We have to know where it attaches. Generally, we have an attachment at the humerus, intertubercular groove. We have an attachment on the inferior aspect of the scapula, and we have an attachment at the thoracolumbar fascia and some attachments down here on the ilium, the innominate. All right? So basically what I have to do is I have to figure out a way to get the lower attachments and the upper attachments, which you can't see, much closer. Now, you didn't think this would come back to breathing. Ian, appreciate you. I will answer your question. You didn't think this would come back to breathing, but it does. Because this thing, the axial skeleton, is going to move based on where I'm at in a phase of inhalation and exhalation. For example, if the upper thorax is in more of a flatter or exhale position, because as I breathe in, the kyphosis of the thoracic spine ought to increase, but if I'm more in this position, that brings the scapulohumeral attachments of the lats a bit closer to the pelvic attachments. As this happens, this corresponds with a nutation or flexion of the sacrum. So that's going to increase the lordosis, which, guess what? That also brings the attachments much closer. This would be a wide infrasternal angle, by the way, if you didn't know about it. Sacrum nutates, lordosis increases, thorax is in a more exhaled or non-kyphotic, flattened position. And what that's going to do when this goes flat is the scaps are going to migrate backwards, like so. Because as this comes forward, my rib cage, the scapula come back. Now we start to see the beginning of imaginary lat syndrome. So I'm lordotic, T-spine goes flat, my scaps retract and they depress, and I'm walking around like so, with a huge, deep lordosis. Now the function, or the action, of the lats on the humeri is internal rotation. Bam! There's your imaginary lat syndrome. That's how it's done. The body is put into a position where the lats get leverage on both ends, and you're walking around with some wide arms. Why would this be advantageous? Well, I'm glad you asked. It would be advantageous because this makes me wider. It widens my theoretical base of support. It helps me balance and manage gravity a bit more effectively. And hey, maybe the chicas in the bro fam love it. That's why that kind of thing might happen for someone. So what you gonna do about it? What you have to do is address the axial skeleton and the position that may have gone in to get someone in imaginary lat syndrome. So what that would entail is addressing infrasternal angle. You may want to use your wide fix for this type of person. I'll link one of my moves in the show notes and some stuff on the wides. So that's one piece. Do that. I'm going to have to get the scaps out of depression, retraction, external rotation, adduction. So think abduction type things. Maybe that's a forward and upward reach. Oh wow, I just killed two birds with one stone. I can go here, here, boom, I get the wide, and I take care of the lat position. Then you do something where you get a little bit of sacral counter nutation. Ooh, we're starting to get in business. So basically, what you do is you take the position that that individual is in, you do the exact opposite, and maybe those lats start to get real and your arms get at your side. So a great move for that might be a 90-90 pullover, as an example. Making sure you don't go too far overhead, because what that could do is it could exaggerate the curve problem that you have, increasing lordosis. Slight flexion, maybe like 120-ish. Get that forward reach, dig your heels down so you get some hammies, and you reduce the lordosis. And that can be a great starting activity for someone who has imaginary lat syndrome. That would be step 1. Steps 2, 3, 4, whatever, that's really going to depend on what else shakes out from your testing. If you got someone who can't externally rotate because the lats are going crazy, you may need to do some things that open up that posterior thorax. You may need to do some things that work on retraining scapular upward rotation and elevation. Really depends on how things shake out. But basically, with anything, and I give imaginary lat syndrome as an example here, but this could be anything, and this is the crux of my course. You take someone who is in a particular presentation, position, find out what they can't do. So a person with imaginary lat syndrome, they got the lats super biased. You get them out of that by doing the exact opposite, make them struggle, and if you do those things, a lot of times you'll get the result you're looking for. Put people in positions they can't get into, make them struggle, and that's typically what you got to do to help them improve their goals. So to summarize, imaginary lat syndrome, basically the two attachments of the lat close together because of the position that the exoskeleton has gone into in order to better manage gravity. This position is wider, therefore it allows you to be more stable. What you have to do to take care of that, the exact opposite. Put the arms overhead, get a forward reach so you get the scaps out of that adducted, externally rotated, retracted position. Do something to reduce the lumbar curve. You do that, your lats be keeping it real then. Tyler, good question. The extra special last question comes from Ian, who asked this on Facebook, so I'm going to answer this for Ian. Would you say there is any particular cupping pattern to turn down common tight muscles associated with a left AIC, so someone who has an asymmetry in their movement capabilities, most of the limitations being on the left side, diaphragm that just won't give? This is a pretty good question, Ian. I don't use cupping, so I can't testify much to what that can or cannot do. But I will say that if you were to go after some of the areas that are typically limited with an individual who presents in this fashion, you could potentially get some good results. I'm not going to knock on manual therapy cupping or anything like that because this stuff works. I've gotten results with manual therapy. I have a lot of colleagues who utilize cupping that get good results. So if you wanted to do something specifically, Ian, to address some of the areas that are maybe limited, with this particular pattern, I would think of going after things such as maybe the posterior left hip. You could think hip flexors. You could think left lower back. Those would be some of the areas that stick out right now. Quads would be another area you could possibly consider. You may even do something on the abdominal region on the sides to get the external oblique to chill. Those would be things that I would consider maybe looking at from a cupping standpoint if I were to utilize that. But again, I don't utilize cupping, so I can't testify much to how that is practiced upon. But I would do that, and then of course if you have any areas that are potentially problematic, maybe going after that. So to summarize that point, figure out where the limitations are, think theoretically what muscles might be implicated in that, do some manual therapy, whatever you use in that area, and you ought to be in business. So thank you, Ian, for that last question, and I think that's a good stopping point for us tonight. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you want to learn more, if you really want to learn more, Human Matrix, guys, is coming September 15th and 16th in Seattle. Again, I will say it. October 27th and 28th in Kansas City, and November 10th and 11th in Portland, Oregon. Sign up now. We are in crunch time, and I want to see you there because I will go way more in depth with some of the stuff I've talked about tonight. If you want to learn more, code is @couples.com. You want to subscribe to the newsletter because you're going to get 3 free talks. We're talking about 90 minutes a pop with these talks, guys. About 50 pages and notes of free, yes free, acute chronic workload calculator. You're going to get access to me sending you emails every Friday letting you know what's good in the interwebs, what's up when you go to zachcouples.com and you subscribe to the newsletter. All types of cool stuff. Also, while you're there, believe it or not, I do offer some services. You can do 3 things with me for now. Movement consultations. Maybe a toy not moving as well as you'd like to. Maybe you can't squat as deep as you want to. Maybe you're feeling some aches, pains, boo-boos. You've ruled out the big bad stuff. You want to say, hey man, maybe if I move better, I'll feel better. I can help you with that. Definitely sign up for a movement consultation. We also, by we meaning me, offer mentoring. Do you want to learn how to apply some of these things that we talked about tonight mo better with your peeps? Do you want to understand anatomy and physiology a little bit better to help you make sounder decisions with your clientele? I can be your guy for that. Definitely hit me up for mentoring. Or maybe you got imaginary lat syndrome and you want those lats to be real lat syndrome. I can be your guy for that because I offer online movement training. With that, once a month, we're going to get a program together designed to your needs because I do a consultation with you for free. Yes, free, when you sign up for the online fitness training. We'll go feedback back and forth. We'll email back and forth, making sure that this is fine-tuned to exactly what you need from a health, wellness, fitness standpoint, whatever your goal is. That's what we do with the movement training online that I'll give you. Otherwise, guys, you want more of me? Because who wouldn't? You can go to iTunes or Stitcher and search the Zach Couples Show. Because guess what? There's 54 other debriefs that you can listen to. You want to look at me for 54 debriefs? Really? I wouldn't want to look at me. But you can bring me to your car. Take me on a long car trip. I like trips along the beach, along the one in California since I'm in Cali. Those are cool to me. That's where I want it to be. So take me in your car, download the Zach Couples Show on iTunes or Stitcher, or do both. Write a little review so the fan grows larger, and we ought to be in business. If you like social media and that's your jam, you can find me on that as well. Facebook.com/ZCouples. My Twitter handle is @ZCouples. And of course, I'm on that Instagram, baby. Zach, Z-A-C, Couples, C-U-P-P-L-E-S. And of course on YouTube, if you just search Zach Couples, you'll find a huge channel with a lot of activities for you and yours. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You're amazing. I hope you keep it real, but not to the extent where things go wrong. Stay hungry, stay learning, stay moving, and I'll see you next time. Deuces.